You begin with a question that appears simple but carries a quiet disruption. How do you know that anything you consider knowledge corresponds to reality? This is the starting point Al-Ghazali insisted upon. He observed that certainty often comes not from truth, but from repetition, comfort, and habit. You rely on your senses, your memory, and the coherence of your thoughts, yet none of these have proven themselves beyond doubt. When you assume they have, you mistake familiarity for verification. Before you approach how God might communicate, or how Ibn Arabi describes the pathways of inner understanding, you must address the structure of your own certainty. If the mind forms conclusions from untested premises, what confidence can you place in the conclusions themselves? The question stays open. What makes the mind trust itself? Al-Ghazali lived in a world where intellectual tension shaped every discussion. Baghdad hosted theologians, philosophers, jurists, and mystics. Each convinced their framework approached truth most effectively. The arguments were intricate and continuous. Yet Al-Ghazali noticed that the more refined the debates became, the less they resolved the essential issues. Reason produced systems, but systems multiplied disagreement. This atmosphere led him inward, toward a mode of inquiry that depended not on external proofs, but on examining the conditions that make certainty possible. Even then, he wondered, can introspection itself remain free from distortion? Al-Ghazali reached a point where every foundation of knowledge felt unstable. He realized that the senses could be mistaken. Rational arguments depended on premises that could not be verified without assuming another unproven premise. Even intuition, often celebrated as a deeper faculty, could imitate insight while remaining the mind's own projection. This recognition did not produce despair, but precision. If every instrument of knowing can be deceived, then understanding divine communication requires more than confidence in those instruments. You are invited to reflect in the same way. If each pathway can mislead, what gives you the authority to affirm any claim as certain? Perhaps the very feeling of clarity is another assumption waiting to be examined. Reason, for Al-Ghazali, was not an enemy. It was a disciplined tool, but he noticed that it dissected thought without grounding its own reliability. Reason can expose contradictions, compare ideas, and arrange them into coherent structures, yet coherence alone does not guarantee truth. You rely on reason because it feels consistent, but reason can operate flawlessly on false premises. When you observe this, a new question forms. If reason cannot justify itself, how can it justify anything beyond itself? This realization does not cancel the value of rational thought. It clarifies that certainty cannot arise from function alone. You begin to see the boundary. Reason organizes inquiry, but it cannot anchor its own foundation. Al-Ghazali concluded that knowledge depends not only on the mind's structure, but on the condition of the heart. A concept becomes clear not because it is argued well, but because the heart is free from bias, desire, and distortion. When the heart is conflicted, it absorbs information selectively. When it seeks confirmation, it transforms conclusions into reflections of preference. For knowledge to be trustworthy, the inner field must be cleared of interference. You begin to notice how often your understanding aligns with what you already want to believe. In this light, divine communication cannot be identified merely by intensity or persuasion. It appears only when the heart reflects without addition. The question remains unresolved. Can the heart ever become fully transparent? Doubt, in Al-Ghazali's method, is not a weakness, but a discipline. It dismantles illusions of certainty that have not undergone examination. you begin to see that untested belief is not knowledge. It is inertia. Doubt becomes the force that removes what has been accepted without scrutiny. This is not skepticism for its own sake, but an attempt to clear the ground so something valid can appear. You start to observe your assumptions about divine communication, what you expect, what you fear, what you prefer. Each assumption shapes what you think you receive. Through disciplined doubt, the question changes. Is the message unclear, or is the listener still entangled in expectation? The inquiry persists without resolution. After the ground is cleared, something subtle becomes noticeable. Insight does not come from argument, but from a transformation within the one who observes. Al-Ghazali described this as a shift in the mode of knowing, not an increase in information. When the mind stops pressing for conclusions, understanding can rise without force. You begin to see how a thought becomes clear when resistance fades. This clarity is not emotional. It is the quiet recognition that something fits without being imposed. Yet, even here, a question endures. If understanding appears only when effort softens, who or what brings it into view? To approach Ibn Arabi's exploration of divine communication, you must examine how understanding forms within you. Ibn Arabi suggests that communication does not occur through external statements, but through the unfolding of meaning in the inner world. These inner signs are not sensations or images. They are shifts in comprehension, alignments of concepts, or the disappearance of confusion. When thought becomes coherent, when questions reduce themselves, or when contradictions resolve, something has communicated. You recognize that such communication depends on the structure of the receiver. If your mind is conditioned in one direction, the meaning you perceive will conform to that conditioning. Al-Ghazali noted the same. The heart reflects only what it is prepared to reflect. You begin to see that the question is not simply how God communicates, but how your inner instrument interprets reality. If every insight is filtered through your assumptions, then even the clearest sign may be shaped by what you bring to it. The unresolved tension remains. Are you encountering guidance, or encountering the consequences of your own readiness? If communication depends on the receiver, then understanding the receiver becomes essential. Ibn Arabi states that the divine address is constant, while human perception varies. Al-Ghazali similarly argued that the heart often obscures truth through its attachments. You begin examining your own interpretive habits. You notice how quickly the mind categorizes an experience as meaningful or meaningless, based on expectations formed long before the moment. You see how inherited beliefs shape what you think you have discovered. If these filters remain unexamined, every insight becomes a mixture of truth and projection. You realize that even your deepest conclusions rely on structures you rarely question. When you observe this directly, the inquiry takes a new form. Can divine communication ever be isolated from the self that receives it? Or is the message inseparable from the medium through which it passes? The question remains suspended, pointing toward a deeper examination of the self itself. At this point, the inquiry no longer seeks answers. It simply recognizes the limits of seeking. Communication is not an event that occurs occasionally. It is a condition that becomes visible when the self becomes quiet. When thought stops insisting on conclusions, meaning reveals itself without being pursued. The searcher sees that truth is not acquired but uncovered through the reduction of interference. In this stillness, nothing new is gained. Nothing is added. What remains is awareness unclaimed by the self. The final question emerges without demand. If truth appears only when the searcher steps aside, Who was searching from the beginning?